Question: how to get rid of the fear of physical pain? It feels like I was tortured physically in past lives. Well, I think many spiritual people, many people in general, have been tortured physically in past lives. You look at the history and you see how many times we could have been in situations. You take the Catholic Inquisition, the witch hunts, the communist, whatever you want to call it, the Soviet Union, but many other societies, even many societies today where torture is taking place. So I'm just saying, I think many spiritual people, we have been tortured in past lives, and therefore, what did we do? I mean, torture is one of the most inhumane, anti-spiritual things that you can do to other people. And it's obviously an activity that comes directly from the fallen beings, where they are trying to take over some people's minds, to get them to torture others. And the purpose is really to create such severe trauma in the souls of the people who are tortured that they can't manifest a higher state of consciousness. They are just so totally caught up in the trauma and dealing with the trauma that they really can't grow on the spiritual path. They can't lock into the spiritual path. So you have to recognize that if you feel this fear of being tortured, it's most likely because you have this trauma from a past life. But really, how to get rid of it? Well, it's like I say in many of my videos where I talk about the subconscious selves, because what is it that happens when you're tortured? Well, it's the same as any other trauma. You are creating one or several subconscious selves to deal with this, to deal with the trauma. And there can be several layers of these selves to deal with it. But I would say that when it comes to people who are open to the spiritual path, we have potentially dealt with some of these. There may still be some energy, untransmuted fear-based energy in your emotional mind that comes from this torture from past lives. So what you do with that is you invoke light from the Ascended Masters by giving the decrees and invocations I have in my playlist. And on transcendencetoolbox.com there are even more of these invocations. So you can look at transcendencetoolbox.com and find these an invocation that you feel appeals to you. So you do that, you invoke light from your Ascended Masters to transform the energy. Because as long as there's a pool of fear-based energy, it's difficult for you to look at the self behind it. But then you start looking at the self, and what I would suggest here is that what I've experienced in myself is that these traumas that happened in past lives, they often took us by surprise, especially when we go further and further back to when we were relatively new on this planet, that we were surprised that anybody would do this to us. We were so shocked by this. So we can create a self that says, it doesn't say, mind you, it doesn't say, I must never be tortured again. It says, I must never be surprised again. I must never be shocked. I must never be taken aback. So what does this self do? It's constantly projecting there could be a risk of being tortured. So this means you have in your subconscious mind this self that's always looking. Wherever you have grown up, could there be a risk that I might be tortured again? And then there's a situation in your country where it seems like there's conflict, there might be war, there might be the threat of war, an invasion or this or that, and all of a sudden this self is now activated. And now you feel this fear and you're overwhelmed by this fear. So the first thing you have to do is realize that the self it doesn't have a realistic evaluation of the actual situation. I mean, you have to look at realistically, is it actually realistic that I might be tortured? And yes, if you live in eastern Ukraine right now, and the Russian army is going to take over your village, there is, as we have seen in Bucha and other places, a realistic possibility you could be tortured. And if you have that, then you need to move. You need to flee. You need to physically protect yourself from this. But in many cases, for many people living in other parts of the world where there isn't conflict, there is a very low risk that you would be physically tortured. So, but that doesn't mean the self isn't there. It's always there. So you won't be free of this until you look at the self and realize that the self was created when you had very little experience with a planet like Earth, an unnatural planet. And therefore you were shocked. And it was actually the shock more than the physical pain that created the trauma. Because you think about it, if you were tortured in a past life, that physical body is now gone. So what remains? Well, it can only be the psychological effects of the physical pain. So what you need to do if you're not in a physical situation where there's a risk of torture, then you need to say, okay, so I'm dragging this self with me that I don't need anymore. Because, first of all, there isn't a very big possibility that I would actually be tortured in this lifetime. Second of all, I have had much more experience on this planet than I had when this first happened. So therefore, I won't react the same way I did back then. I won't be as shocked, I won't be as surprised. So in other words, I have a self that was created as a defense mechanism, but is unnecessary. I don't need it anymore. And that's why you have to use the tools and techniques that I've given and that the Ascended Masters have given, for example, in the book Healing Your Spiritual Traumas, and uncover that self that has that fear, and then you need to let go of that fear. You need to consciously see it, consciously see what made you believe that you needed to react this way, that this was the only way to react. You see that there's another way to react, and then you can just let the self go. You see, the self is projecting. There's a problem. You could be tortured. You need to avoid this. So you need to protect yourself in all kinds of ways. But the problem isn't real. You have to come to see that this is not a real problem. But it's still affecting you as long as you believe it's real. And therefore you have to, instead of trying to solve the problem, protect yourself from this danger, you have to let the self die. You have to simply let the self die. And I know this is not easy when you have this fear, but what I'm saying is, if you use the invocations and decrees to transform the energy, and if you use the tools for exposing the self, you can come to a point where the conscious you separates itself from the self. Instead of looking through the perception filter of the self, you can now look at the self from the outside. You can see that whatever the self is projecting at you, this fear of physical pain, it's just a projection. It's just a projection. And therefore, you can decide, I'm not this self. I created the self in a specific situation, but I haven't become the self. And therefore, I can let it die. Because I won't die when I let the self die. In fact, I will be free when I let the self die. And I don't think there's any other way. You know, trauma is there in our emotional, mental identity bodies, perhaps even to some degree in the physical cells. And until we let it go and release it, it will affect us. It will drag us down, and it will cause this division in our psyche that can be so severe that people can't function. You know, I'm not trying to be insensitive. I mean, I have met people who have such severe trauma from past lives that they can't function very well in this lifetime, because they are so divided in our psychology. There's such a split in our psychology. So it's not that I am trying to be insensitive to that, but I'm just saying that in my long experience on the path, my studies, my observations on myself and other people, I see that the underlying mechanism behind all trauma is this kind of a self, a subconscious self. And it is based on an illusion, and it is possible to let it go. And you are not going to let it go until the conscious you comes to that point of seeing, but it's unreal. It's not me. I don't need it. I can survive without it. In fact, I can be free, more free without it. And I want to be free. I don't want to drag this with me. And when you come to that point where you've separated yourself from it, you can just let the self die. And that's the magic of this teaching that the masters have given. Instead of being so focused on solving the problem as the self always is, you're stepping outside the self and its perception filter, and you see that you can, instead of trying to solve the problem outside yourself, you can just let the self die. And that's, in my experience, the only way to really heal a trauma, when you let the self die. Because what is a trauma? Many psychologists, they look at this as some passive thing that happened to you. It was something that was done to you. But you see, as I've explained also, what affects you is not what was done to you, but what you did to yourself as a reaction to what was done to you. In other words, it was the subconscious self you created in reaction to the outer situation. Now, take care here. I'm not denying that something really severe happened to you. I'm not saying this is unreal. I'm not like some of these non-duality people saying that, oh, everything is unreal, therefore we can just ignore the trauma. That's not what I'm saying. This did happen in a physical situation, and you did create the subconscious self. And the subconscious self is there in your subconscious mind, and you are dragging it with you from lifetime to lifetime. Not in any way making light of this. I'm not telling you that the event that happened wasn't real, or that the self isn't real. The self is real in the sense that it's there, but it isn't ultimately real in the sense that it's based on an illusion. So that's why I'm saying it's not a matter of making light of the trauma, but it is a matter of coming to the point where you realize that what affects you today is not the actual event that happened. It's the subconscious self you have. And that subconscious self was created in the past where you didn't have the maturity, the experience that you have now. Therefore, you would have reacted differently in the past if you had had the level of awareness you have now. And that means you can now let go of the self, because you don't need that self. It's the experience I've given, or the example I've given before. If you were bullied by an older child when you were 5 years old, you created a self in reaction to that, and now that you're an adult, you're still reacting to being bullied the same way you did when you were 5. And that's obviously not constructive. So what I'm saying is, you need to come to the point where you see that the self and the problem it projects is not real. And the self is not you. So therefore, you can let the self die. And when you let the self die, you are not affected by the trauma anymore. Again, what was the trauma? It wasn't what happened. It was how you reacted to it. And your reaction created the self. And the self is like a program, computer program. It can only continue to project that you have to react this way. So the threat of torture and physical pain, well, we are still on a natural planet. Unfortunately, the Earth is still where there is torture going on this planet. So the self is projecting, you have to remove torture from Earth. You have to bring Earth to a point where there's no more risk of torture. Then you can feel safe. But what I'm saying is, This is the self projecting this. And why is the self projecting this? Because it wants to survive. This is another magic of this teaching about the subconscious self. Is once the self is created, it has a certain rudimentary consciousness, a certain survival instinct, and it just wants to survive. So, and it can only do this by engaging you to give it energy. And it does this by repeating its programming, projecting, oh, there's a risk of torture, you should be afraid of it, you should be reacting to it, you should be expecting what might happen. So what I'm saying is, this is very real. This is happening in your psychology, in your subconscious mind. But what the self projects is not real, because it is based on an old situation where you reacted a certain way. And what I'm saying is that the trauma is only affecting you through the self, which is based on an illusion. And when you see that, when you let the self, I can assure you, I have done this innumerable times in my own life. Come to see something, come to see a self, and just let it go. And as soon as you let go of it, you feel freer. You simply feel freer. And, you know, I understand, because I have met people. I have met people that I couldn't see how to help them. Because it was almost like they were so divided that on the one hand they wanted to let go of the pain, on the other hand they didn't. So they couldn't decide with their conscious minds, do I really want to let go of the pain? And so it was like they could see something like what I've explained here, they could understand it intellectually, but they couldn't let go of the pain. They couldn't separate themselves from the self, because the division, the pain was so strong that they couldn't step outside of it. And so I understand that there is just no surefire method that will help old people. And what I can give you here is only what has worked for me. And if that doesn't work for you, then you need to pursue other avenues of healing, whether therapy or whatever it might be for you. So I'm not trying to say that this method should work for everybody, because I have met people who were so deeply wounded that they just weren't able to separate themselves from it. They weren't able to look at it from a different perspective. And I don't know how to help such people. That's beyond my experience. So I'm just saying, then pursue other avenues of healing if the problem is so severe. But I think that many people, if they really use this method that the Ascended Masters have given for resolving these subconscious selves, you will really make a lot of progress. And it might take time. I mean, for me it took many years. But still, I really believe it'll work for most people. But the thing is, you have to give it a try. And that's what I see in many people. I'm not saying there aren't people that have very severe trauma that would be difficult to resolve, but I also see many spiritual people that they don't want to make the effort. They don't want to do enough work. They're expecting that this should be able to be resolved in a fairly easy way, where they don't really have to confront the pain or confront the illusion behind it. They have to do some work, they're okay with that, but they don't really want to, keep going through deeper and deeper layers of the psyche until they are free. And, that's another attitude that, such people can't be helped, because they are not really willing to do what it takes to overcome it. So, I don't know. I wish I could give people some method that would work for everybody. But I've realized there probably is no such method. I don't think there is. But I just hope that what I've given here will at least work for some people. Because I have definitely experienced that it works on myself. I have dealt with some very deep traumas from past lives. not only the fear of physical torture, which I don't think is the worst. I actually think psychological torture is much worse than physical. But of course you can say physical torture really has the aim of torturing people psychologically, so, whatever. But nevertheless, I have experienced myself that you can heal this, and I know many other people who have used these methods, and it works. It works for them as well. So I hope this has at least helped you see that if you have these very severe fears, whether it's physical pain or something else, there is something you can do about it.